Hello ladies and gentlemen, I'm your host at Creepy Reading, and today I want to do a few shoutouts before we delve into the 10 new Let's Not Meet stories. Number 1, I would like to give a shout out to the Sticky Paddle. Yes, the Sticky Paddle. I absolutely love Mullet Mike. We've worked together before, and I would love to be able to have lunch with the guy. Mullet Mike is the dude who really got me into creepypasta / true story / all that type of thing. Mullet Mike, if it wasn't for you, I wouldn't be doing this on YouTube today. 100,000 subscribers here wouldn't be watching me right now. So if you wouldn't mind giving my good friend Mullet Mike a good old sticky shout out, I would be much appreciated. Not to mention, he's starting season 6 of Creepy Gaming. Secondly, I would like to thank every single author that appears today in this video. I will be mentioning you each by your username using the Reddit pages, and I would like to say I enjoyed each and every single one of these stories. Me, Sir Ayme, DrCreepenVanPasta, and Mr. Blue Spooky really put a lot of effort into this narration, and if you wouldn't mind checking out their channels at the end of the video, I'd be much appreciated. With that being said, sit back, relax, turn down the lights. We got 10 horrifying Let's Not Meet stories for your viewing consumption.
Political Hatred by Leo Deschain 092. I'm a 29-year-old guy from Brazil. I'm a teacher at a university here, and I practice Kung Fu in my spare time. The political scene in Brazil is insane these days, and I've even heard stories about people getting attacked on the streets just because they're wearing red, which happens to be the color of President Dilma's political party. Well, a few days ago, I was heading home from work late at night. It was around 11 p.m. I got on the bus and, as there were no seats available, I just stood near the exit door, as I always do. I got my MP3 player from my backpack and turned on some The Black Dahlia Murder. I was there, minding my own business, silently singing along, when I noticed a guy sitting in the back of the bus, staring at me with a really creepy look on his face. I thought it was funny at first, but he just didn't stop staring at me. I figured he must have been lost in his thoughts and just happened to be looking in my direction. So I went to the other door and looked at him again. You guessed it. He was still staring at me. Now, I started paying attention to this guy. Even sitting, he was huge. His arms were as thick as my legs. He looked like the fucking Hulk from those old movies. I was really tired from work that day, so I shrugged it off and went back to minding my own business. I mean, maybe he was jealous because of my awesome beard. The point is, I had no energy to deal with that right then. And maybe I was just being paranoid. My mistake. My stop was coming up, so I pulled the string. Well, I don't know how buses work where you guys live, but here they have little strings attached to the ceiling, and when we want to stop, we pull. A few seconds later, the driver stopped the bus and I got off, but not before seeing the huge guy get up. I started walking, feeling a bit nervous, and when I looked back, there he was, tailing me. He didn't even bother pretending he was just going home or something. He had his eyes locked on me the entire time. Now that we were both standing, I saw that he had a good 20 centimeters over me. I'm 1.82 m, by the way. So yeah, this guy was huge. I started walking faster, and his footsteps also got faster. My street was on the next left, and it's very, very dark at night. So I realized I'd have to run if I didn't want that dude to catch up with me. As soon as I turned the corner, I ran like there was no tomorrow. I heard the guy start running as well. Fuck. There was no way I could outrun him. My house was still pretty far away. I decided to go all in and stopped. I turned to face him, took off my backpack, held it in my hand, and waited. He yelled something to the effect of, "I'll kill you, you commie fuck," and attacked. I threw my backpack into his face, and when it was about to hit, he dodged. I even saw a smile on his face, like he thought it was fun that I fought back. Well, turns out that's exactly what I was waiting for. Remember how I told you that I practice Kung Fu? Well, I've been practicing it for over 10 years. When he dodged the backpack, my right foot was waiting to meet his jaw. It was only for a fraction of a second, but I saw his smile turn into a "what the fuck" expression as my foot touched his face. His eyes rolled up and he dropped to the sidewalk. I grabbed my backpack, and before booking it back to my house, I saw a shiny object sticking out of his pocket. A knife. Fuck. This guy wanted to do some serious damage. And all of that because I have a big beard and was wearing a red shirt. If it weren't for my passion for martial arts, I would never have seen my wife and kids again. I won't lie to you and say that I had it all under control, that it was okay, and that I didn't feel scared. I was scared as fuck. By the time I got home, my legs were shaking so badly I had to ask my wife to help me to the nearest chair. She asked what was going on, and I told her. We called the police, but the guy had already gone when they arrived. We're moving to a new place in a few days. After all, he followed me to my street and could be looking for me. And the good part is this: my wife always nagged me for doing my kung fu. After what happened, she orders me to keep practicing and is thinking of joining as well as bringing the kids along. At least something good came out of it.
When I was younger, not sure of my exact age, but probably around grade 2 or 3, my grandparents took me to a church retreat at a place called Nova Nada Monastery. It was in the middle of the woods. I remember when we went to a church service, we went into a library. I don't remember much of what else we did until it came to lunchtime. They had something like a potluck for all of us to eat. There were a lot of people there. You could either eat inside or go outside. My grandparents wanted to eat inside, but they let me eat outside because they figured I wouldn't go too far. So I went outside and sat down alone to eat. Before long, a male and female approached me. They were probably in their early 20s from what I can remember. They started talking to me, asking me if I liked it there and if I was having fun. I said yes. Then, the female asked me if I would like to go for a walk in the woods with them and look at nature. Just as a side note, I used to love going for walks in the woods. My dad had been taking me into the woods by my great-grandparents' house since I was old enough to walk. So I told them that I wanted to, but that I would have to ask my grandmother. They tried to talk me out of it. They said, "I'm sure she won't mind. We won't be gone for long." I insisted, mainly because I'm sure my grandmother would have kicked my ass if I took off without telling her. I went inside and asked, and my grandparents told me no. I wasn't going to go off with any strangers. I begged and begged. Then, my grandmother got mad and said not only was I not going off with any strangers, I was staying with them for the whole rest of the time. The one thing she did allow was me to go back outside to tell them I couldn't go. So I go outside, and they're nowhere to be found. They weren't where we were sitting, and I couldn't find them anywhere else. It scares me to think of what might have happened if I went with them. But I was more scared at the time of what my grandmother would do to me if I took off without telling her. It wasn't until I was older that I realized they were probably up to no good.
The CHARTHAM Brick Thieves by Oxygen Thief. I have not been on this Reddit much, but I've listened to the stories and I thought I might as well tell mine. This took place about 4 years ago. I was around 14 at the time, and me and my friends used to, and still do, explore abandoned buildings. I live in Kent, England, and as anyone who lives around Kent, England knows, there aren't many abandoned sites around this area. So that meant revisiting the same sites a lot, and one of the most popular sites was CHARTHAM Asylum. I've included a picture on screen right now just for general interest, and as you can see from that picture, the site is decrepit, and it's empty to all hell. It's what we call a shell site. There are 4 buildings on this site, and the story takes place on the main large building, which is where the pictures come from. So me, my friend Callum, and his younger brother went to this asylum one weekend to have another look around and see if there were parts of this building we hadn't seen before. So we'd been there for about a few hours, looking around, taking photos, and at the same time, I was lugging around a big, expensive-looking camera, a 5D Mach 3 that had just recently come out. So I was a bit worried about it getting damaged or someone seeing a teenager with an expensive camera and thinking, oh, let's go steal it. And that was a constant worry. In the building grounds, there's an area in the middle that is open to air, and we'd heard rumors that there were a couple of people who would visit the site, steal old bricks from the roof, and sell it to secondhand sellers. You can still see where they were in a couple of the pictures above. Unfortunately, they appeared out of nowhere on the roof. They had what looked like a crowbar or some similar tool that they were using to knock bricks out. We were standing outside in the open area for a few seconds looking at them, and for some bloody reason, one of them literally looked out and noticed us completely unprovoked. So we all ran out of the site and then back into the building and hid in one of the rooms. In hindsight, running into the building was not the best idea that you could do. It's akin to one of those stupid mistakes one of those teenagers will make in one of those horror movies. We could have ran off the grounds, but for some reason, we didn't. We heard them running around and trying to find us. I managed to make out what one of them said. He's got a fucking camera. He's taking pictures. They thought I was taking pictures of them stealing bricks, possibly to give to the police, or maybe they just wanted to steal my camera. Or maybe they just wanted to prevent both. Maybe it would be easy for them to take both. We waited there for a few minutes until we couldn't hear them, and then left the room and started walking down one of the hallways to get out, as we were a bit spooked and there was a man with a armed weapon lurking around this very fucking building. Either that, or he realized that maybe we got away, and perhaps he went to go try to get away before the police got here. That's when we started walking down one of the main hallways, and we heard running behind us. I looked at my friend and pointed to one of the holes in the floor to hide in. They shook their heads though and ran off and down the hallway. But I'm not an idiot. I know that not a lot of people know about these little hidden air vents, so I stayed in one of the holes. The holes in the floor were hatches that went to an underfloor heating system full of asbestos. I scooted up against the wall under there and waited. They soon walked up, looking in all the rooms, tapping the crowbar on the floor above my head. It was really bloody scary. And that's when one of them said, "Look there. What if they went inside?" I can only assume one of them was gesturing to the holes in the floor. I genuinely thought that I was gonna get the shit beaten out of me and have my equipment stolen. I kept quiet. I kept prone. One of them dropped down and looked into the hole. I saw his face. And then he said, "Mate, I can't see shit down here. Fuck this. Help me out." Luckily for me, none of them had a torch or thought to use their phones or anything. Since I was the only one there, and I was only a meter away from him when he looked down there, if he had any of those things, they would have found me and my camera. I waited a while and jumped out and then legged it out of there, and I made it to the tree line. I called Callum, and then they joined me a few minutes later. Him and his brother went into the room around that corner, which they never checked, thank God. Sorry the story isn't that grisly or violent, but the prospect of what if that really scares me. Thanks for listening.
This happened about 3 years ago, and it is still one of the creepiest things that has ever happened to me. For background, I live in a city of just over 100,000 people. Not huge, but it has a lot of suburbs on the edge of town. I lived near downtown, but my friend lived right in the middle of one of those suburbs. I was leaving her house at around 11:30 at night, and while I can't remember what day of the week it was, I remember not being terribly worried about running into anyone. From her house to mine was around 8 miles, and I was driving an e-bike, which is kind of like an electric moped that can only go about 20 miles per hour. Since the speed limit was usually 25 or 30 in the city, I was used to cars speeding around me. It was no biggie. Anyway, I leave her place and start driving home. The first half of the trip is uneventful, but as you get closer to downtown, the neighborhoods get rougher. Right around the halfway point, I'm parked at an intersection when I notice a kind of beat-up red Sunfire behind me. I thought it was a bit weird that they didn't pull up beside me, since cars at intersections usually did. I kept to the right side like any other cyclist would. But e-bikes were pretty new in my town at that point, so I figured they just didn't know how much space to give me. The light changes, I drive on, and it takes me another 2 blocks to realize the car is not passing me. This is where I realized things were weird. The car was trailing behind me only about 20 or 30 feet, and was coasting at 20 miles per hour despite the fact that there were no other cars anywhere on the road, so overtaking me would be easy. It was weirding me out, but I figured they would get bored and move on eventually. A couple miles later, I started heading into downtown, and sure enough, the car was still following me. I could only see them in my mirrors, but I could tell there were at least 2 people in the car, so I was outnumbered too. I started to get worried as I got closer to home, realizing that I'm going to have to stop eventually, and wondering what will happen when I do. My house, despite being downtown, was on a quiet street that barely got any traffic and wasn't very well lit. As I'm approaching a yellow light, I decide to risk running it to leave them behind at the red light. I turn left, only to be greeted by another red light. Thinking quick, I turn right on the red, but I can hear the squealing tires as the first light turns green, and the car circles around the block, the way I didn't go, to meet up with me. At this point, I'm facing the car on a side street dead on. I have 2 choices: drive towards the car or turn left. The car is not moving, instead waiting for me to make a decision. I turn left as it's the way towards my house, and the car calmly turns to follow behind me. At this point I'm losing it. Even though it's cold and I'm shaking like mad, I take out my cell phone and call my boyfriend. I know, I should have called the police, but I was freaking out. I tell him he had better get his ass outside of our place right now, because there was no way in hell I'm stopping alone. At the same time, I'm describing the make and model of the car as best I can, while also trying not to crash. When the people in the car realize I'm on the phone, they decide to overtake me. As they do, I look over and see two men, rough-looking, probably in their 30s. They are laughing their heads off, not in a what a fun joke, but in a cruel way, like they're going to get me no matter what. Oh, it's absolutely terrifying. I figured that they thought I was calling the cops, so I started to calm down. They're still going pretty slow ahead of me, but at least they aren't following me anymore. As I'm coming up to the street I live on, I make sure to wait until they're past the intersection before I put on my right blinker. And they put on theirs. I turn onto the street as their tires squeal again, turning onto the street one block up. I know that they can go faster than me, and I contemplate trying to find somewhere to hide. I decide against it, and sure enough, as I come up to the first intersection, their car is sitting perpendicular to me, waiting for me to pass so they can follow me again. It seemed like it was some kind of hilarious, cruel game to them, watching me try to get away and knowing they could always go faster. As we approached my house, I saw my boyfriend standing on the lawn, arms crossed and leering at the car. He wasn't good for much, but I'm glad as hell he was there. I pulled into the driveway, and as the car was halfway into the driveway as well, they finally saw him. They were gone before I could even turn my bike off. So, creepy, nasty men who decided I'd be their fun game for the night? Let's not meet.
Saved by Bikers by JThrowaway121. My dad worked at a beachside bar and grill when I was little. In addition to being a chef, he ran and DJ'd the bike and car shows for the restaurant. The car shows were usually on Wednesdays, and the bike nights were on Friday. Now, this is a small detail, but important to the story. The car shows were on a school night, so I was rarely allowed to go. But my father would often bring me to the bike nights. By all accounts, I was an adorable and pretty mellow kid, and the bikers absolutely loved me. And yes, you might say that this was no environment for a little girl, but I learned a lot about loyalty and friendship from being around the bikers. My dad told me that some of them would call into the restaurant just to ask if I would be there that week, and they'd often bring me stuffed animals and candy. My favourite of the bikers was a man that I affectionately called Uncle Teddy. He was a friend of my parents and an absolute mountain of a man, around 6'8" and easily 400 pounds. He was an ex-Marine who loved his Harley and his cigars, and every week for 5 years he would bring me a Butterfinger and a Beanie Baby. I was 6 years old the night it happened. My father had brought me to the bike show, as he normally did, but I couldn't keep my eyes open past 8 p.m. The show didn't end until 10, so my dad had gotten into the habit of putting an air mattress in the back of the restaurant, and he and Teddy would check on me every 15 minutes. I was asleep when I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was a man that I'd seen around before, and he wasn't dressed in biker gear. He was wearing a short-sleeved plaid shirt and jeans, and looked greasy, but not particularly scary. He smiled at me and told me that his name was Sean, that he was a friend of my dad's, and my dad had asked him to drive me home. Now, my parents had tried to ingrain stranger danger into me, and they told me 1,000 times to never talk to anyone I didn't know. But he knew mine and my dad's name, as well as the nickname everyone called me. I totally bought it. I got up, grabbed the flamingo beanie baby Uncle Teddy had given me, and started to walk towards the parking lot. Sean didn't have a bike. He had a very old 4-door sedan. He opened the back door for me, and I climbed inside. Now, you know how in senior citizens' homes, they often have plastic-wrapped couches or chairs? Well, that's what the backseat of his car was like. Totally covered in plastic. I think now that it was probably so there would be no trace of DNA left on it. Sean started to drive away, and to this day, I can't believe how lucky I got. He had parked the car behind the restaurant in a way that it wasn't immediately visible to the bike show. But as we pulled away, I saw Teddy heading through the door, presumably to check on me. He just happened to look up at the exact right moment, probably to acknowledge the car, and I smiled at him. Uncle Teddy didn't waste a moment, didn't even stop to tell my dad what was going on. He got on his bike and was on that car's ass before we'd even totally cleared the avenue that led out of the parking lot. The avenue that you had to take to get to the restaurant was long, about 1.5 miles, and then you had to go down another long road before you made it to the highway. Sean saw Teddy approaching in his rear view and attempted to speed up, but he must have realized it was futile. He'd been seen, and Teddy had his license plate number and a good description. Sean stopped the car, turned around, and told me very calmly to get out of the car. I was scared at this point, and I didn't waste a moment climbing out and running to Teddy. Sean burned rubber driving away, and Teddy held me for a moment before putting me on the back of his bike and taking me back to my dad. By the time we got back, the cops had been called, and they were surrounding the place. A lot of the show had emptied out, and my dad was sobbing and screaming on the sidewalk outside the restaurant. I'll never forget that moment. I ran up to him, hugged him as tightly as I could, and then the rest is all a blur. I talked to the cops. I talked to my dad. I even went down to the station and spoke to a sketch artist. I didn't get home until around 2 a.m. Teddy never left my side. An APB was put out on the vehicle, which had been reported as stolen. The sketch circulated around the local news stations, but it didn't turn up anything concrete. At one point, I was asked to look at a lineup, but none of them were him. Fast forward about 8 years. I was 14, and my dad decided I was old enough to know what had happened. Sean had been spotted lurking around the bike show a few times before that night, and was a customer at the restaurant fairly regularly. He knew my nickname because he'd been watching me for over a month. He knew my schedule, and, consequently, how often Teddy and my dad checked on me. When his evil plan was botched, and Teddy brought me back to the show, everyone had left. I'd assumed it was because the police had been investigating a crime scene. But I was wrong. They were all out looking for Sean. Teddy told them the make and the model of the car, with a description of Sean. And one of the guys thought that he sounded like a guy that frequented one of the biker bars downtown. I remember my dad paused for a long time, and I asked him, what happened after that? They found him, he said.
this next story was submitted to my Facebook page. If you want to submit your own stories, follow That Creepy Reading on Facebook and submit your narrations or your actual stories to them. Just make sure you're able to prove that you are the writer of the original story. That way, I know that you aren't giving me someone else's work and then permission to narrate it. With that being said, let's look at Being Stalked at Work. It's Horrifying by Mountain Dew 2. I'm a young man who works at a discount retail store. It's not really all that interesting. My job is to come in around the night hours and straighten up the aisles, assist customers, offer assistance, people thank me for my work, and then they go off and buy their stuff and leave. Except for one guy. I was straightening up the health and beauty items when a guy in his late 20s or early 30s came in wearing a tan baseball cap and a leather jacket. He came by and asked me how I was doing, and I responded with that work enthusiasm everyone has had used at least once in their life. And he begins to talk with me, asking me about my work and such, and I wasn't creeped out at this point. Why would I? He was just a guy who was talking to me. Just as I thought he was being friendly, he walked off for a while, and then came back and begun asking me about myself. Well, it started to get uneasy. He asked me where I went to school, and I explained to him I wasn't in school at the moment. He acted as if he knew where I had gone to high school and started to make assumptions about the place as if he had attended the school himself, which probably should have set off red flags. Eventually, he got me into the, oh god, this guy isn't in the right fucking state of mind. And that's when he asked me if I was good at organizing because he needed some help at his home. I declined, of course, and moved on. But somehow he even knew my schedule, which made it worse. That was 4 days ago, and that's when I was also called by my supervisor, whom I told exactly after he left if I wanted to make up some hours and work tonight. I accepted and came down for my usual night shift. I felt alright, thinking he might have given up in the 4 days' time, but I was wrong. Around an hour and a half into my shift, I noticed a familiar figure, leather jacket, and tan baseball cap. Immediately, I ducked into another aisle and kept alert. He was moving around where he thought he saw me last time, looking around the aisles but not finding what he was looking for. He left not too long after, but not before I informed my supervisor of him. She kept her eye on him and kept me posted. Turns out, he was with 2 other people, or so it seemed, all looking around but not really finding anything or purchasing anything. One of the others, who was a woman, had filled her cart but only bought like 1 or 2 items, like a pack of gum, while a man, who I spoke to before but bought nothing and walked out, and then started talking on his phone outside of the store. After the store closed, I noticed a yellow car in the parking lot, moving all over the place, but staying in a general area. I reported that to my supervisor as well. When it was time for me to leave the store, I was shaking, physically shaking. I felt ill. As I walked over to my mother's car and hopped in, I told her to drive carefully and watch for anyone trailing us, which I did the same. We didn't have any trailers, and quite thankfully, I'm still quite a bit shaken. I would like to add a few quick edits. After this whole situation, apparently those people have been going to my place of work and telling my coworkers that they were my friends from school and that they knew me personally. It was... After my manager approached him and let him know that they were going to call the police if they kept on stalking me and harassing me, he seemingly vanished off the face of the earth. Apologies for the late updates. I've been real busy, and this whole situation has been making me feel uneasy.
This will be my second post. I remembered it after I finished writing my first one. This is somewhat from my perspective, and somewhat from my brother's. He has a better memory than I, and I was only 6 at the time. One day, my brother Killian and I were playing outside at my father's house. My father lived in a pretty recluse area, and the only house close to us was my father's girlfriend's father's house. So my brother and I were pretty safe from other people. Killian wasn't really interested in playing anywhere with me, so he had wandered off. I didn't know where he went, but apparently he was building a bomb shelter in the dirt piles near the woods. I didn't notice. Because it was summer, it was hot outside, and I was bored. Being an insistent and stubborn child, I was wearing a long-sleeved shirt and tall boots for a little kid, and my dad just let me. I desperately wanted ice cream, because I was overheating by choice. Apparently there were other houses near ours, and because a man came walking up the gravel road, which struck me as strange. The area was usually so deserted that my father had gotten away with letting me drive and crash his car into a ditch without anyone seeing or being harmed, in midday. The man smiled, and this part I remember. I don't really remember much else. He took a lick of his ice cream and asked, "Want some?" I nodded. Although academically I was a smart child, I was also incredibly naive. I would have gone with anyone for even the most thoughtless lie. I had obviously, like many kids, been told 1,000 times not to talk to strangers and to never go with them, but I never really understood why. I was also incredibly rebellious to authority. The lack of understanding and rebelliousness were often a bad combo. To put it bluntly, I was dumb. The man, who appeared middle-aged with horn-rimmed glasses, smiled wider and said, "Why don't you come to my house with me, and I'll get you some ice cream?" The bells of what my parents said about strangers were going off, but again, I was 6 and I was dumb. "I'll even let you pet my cat." I was sold. I wanted to tell him about my own kitten that I had heard meowing in the dumpster and heroically rescued. Now from here, I don't really remember anything. This is all what my brother recalls. Apparently, my brother came to check on me just as the man reached for my hand and immediately realized something was wrong. "Jezebel?" He called out my name, and when I stuck out my tongue at him and said something about ice cream, he realized what was happening. My brother is only a year and a half older than me, but he was also more wary of people. He didn't really like people as much as he pretended he didn't like me. He liked people even less when they interacted suspiciously with me. As a kid, strange people interacting with me was a common occurrence because of my strange appearance, which plays a small part into what the man apparently said later. I have caramel mocha-colored skin, so you can definitely tell I'm a mix of some colored minority. My hair is dark brown, and was long and curly. But it's my eyes that really make my appearance strange. Genetics decided that instead of the dark, nearly black eyes my mother has, I was to get incredibly light blue-green eyes. My eyes were also extremely wide in proportion to my incredibly small build. Killian glared at the man and told him to leave us alone and that we didn't want any ice cream. I pouted and said that I wanted ice cream, and the man's smile got bigger and creepier, which gave my brother chills. Sweet ice cream for a pretty girl. Killian was even more unnerved, but I didn't notice anything. My brother again attempted to call me to him, but I responded by telling him that I wouldn't go with him. I wanted ice cream. Killian thought about getting my dad, but he didn't want to leave me alone with this guy. That was when the guy decided to pull me along the path with him. Apparently, I still thought I was getting ice cream, so I went along happily. Killian followed, because he didn't think he had any other choice. Eventually, because I was a kid who really didn't like being touched often, I forced the guy to let go of my hand. The man kept glaring at my brother, like he was angry that he was following. "My favorite girls look like you." My brother was really freaked out, but he knew he had to go with because he didn't want to leave me and I was too stubborn. Eventually, we reached this freezer. There was some kind of shack thing that the freezer plugged into, but that was it. This is my brother's description, so I can't give many details. The man opened the freezer to grab the ice cream, and my brother took that time to grab me, covering my mouth so I wouldn't scream. He pointed at a knife in the weeds that dumbass me didn't notice, and I apparently got the hint real fast that I wasn't safe. Without needing him to prompt me, my brother and I took off like bats out of hell. The man didn't try to pursue, and my brother never saw him again. To the fucker who lures dumb children like myself with promises of ice cream and cats, I hope to meet you again. I'll fucking castrate you.
The Baby Man, possible serial killer from the 80s? By Guernsey. This isn't my own encounter, but in fact my mother's when she was around 19 to 21 years old. If you're not fucked and reading all this, too long didn't read, my mother was almost a victim of a creepy serial killer, Baby Man, who verbally uses axes as a signature weapon. Let me give you a little bit of background. She lived alone in a small unit in Richmond, Melbourne, and worked night shifts at a restaurant. Because she worked late nights, she would sleep during the day, wake up around 2 to 3 p.m. She had a friend who would visit her place regularly around the time she woke up, and they would eat a small meal together, hang out for a couple hours, and this was a part of my mother's daily routine. Let's get into the story. One night my mom was at the laundromat, alone, and she noticed a smallish looking European or Middle Eastern man, macho looking dude, unloading a washing machine full of baby clothes. Like a ridiculous amount of baby clothing. To my mom, the whole scene looked weird and out of place. The guy didn't seem right, his demeanor didn't fit the load of baby clothing he was hauling off. And, well, he tended to have this weird blank stare. When the man looked over my mom, she experienced that weird blank stare firsthand. But I should mention that my mom, she said that she didn't think much of it at the time. She left shortly after for load and drove back to her unit. A couple weeks later, my mom finished her shift at work and drove back to her place, went to bed, woke up the next day in the afternoon, and soon heard a knock on her front door. Assuming that it was her friend, she started walking down the hallway, and you could see a frosted window at the end. She saw a smallish figure, the exact size of her friend, and didn't have any thought that it could be anyone else but who she expected. My mom said that when she was halfway down the hallway, her body suddenly stopped in its tracks, and an immediate feeling of crippling fear came over her. She was frozen, staring at the shape of the figure for a moment, when an unknown voice said something like, "Hey, come open the door, it's me." My mom slowly walked back down the hallway and into her bedroom. She waited in her room for the unknown visitor to leave. However, this male visitor didn't. Every couple of minutes he would say things like, "Hey, come let me in. I know you're in there, I saw you. Why don't you open the door?" According to my mom, she waited in her room for maybe 2 hours, listening to the stranger call out to her. The unit is a tiny, easily accessible unit. She was afraid that the person outside would hear and find a way to get inside. She mentioned that after waiting for so long, she couldn't handle the cold temperature of her room. She was barely wearing anything. No, she had only been sleeping beforehand. She finally got the guts to jump and bolt for the kitchen, which had a back door. She ran out the back door and into the street behind her unit. She had a neighbor who she was friends with, and she went straight to her place with the neighbor. She explained what happened, and they both looked out the person's window and had a view of my mom's unit. Her street was in a U shape, so they could see the stranger standing out front of my mom's door. It was the same man from the laundromat from a few weeks earlier. And that's when they finally got the brains to call the police. But the man left before anyone came. After the incident, my mom stayed at her parents' house for a few days. Soon, she felt safe enough to go live in her own unit again. A couple weeks after her moving back to the unit, she begins receiving notes, letters, and other strange oddities from under her door. According to my mom, the letters had strange things written on them, stuff that she never told me. But she mentioned that the sentences and words were extremely amateur, as if written by a 6-year-old. You know, letters were squiggly, poorly written, letters were backwards, and they were written back to front and arranged in strange sequences. My mom would give the notes into the police station, but they weren't treated as a threat. They continued for maybe a few weeks, possibly a month. One day, Mom woke up in the afternoon after her previous night shift. It was another regular day, but she felt that she needed to spend the night at her parents' house. She left, spent the night, and then got a call the next day to find the strange man from the first incident had returned to her unit the same time she had left, and made his way to the back of the unit with an axe. And unfortunately, he started hacking down her back door like a madman. He was seen by a neighbor who called the police. However, the man left before the police came. He apparently went like a whirlwind through her home. Anyway, it turned out that the man's description, partnered with the strange note my mom was receiving, fit the policeman's belief that the man was suspect for rape and murder for a number of girls in Melbourne from the 70s onwards. He wasn't caught, and I don't know if he ever was. He most likely is still out there. I found a site that might contain possible murders by the baby man. I also wondered if a few men around this area, ages 56 and older, with pedophilia and murder crimes, could be this baby man. Anyway, I've left links in the description, so if you happen to be in the Melbourne area and might be able to find a description of this man, I highly recommend, and this isn't a part of the story, that you call the police, because this is an actual person, and if they can bring him to justice, I'm glad that I can do my part to make sure it happens.
Backpacking in the Alabama Wilderness by CMVR2256. This happened about 6 years ago, when I was about 12, and my brother was 26 at that time. My brother had been serving in the US Army for several years when this happened, and was deploying to the Middle East on his second deployment, if I remember correctly. Also of note was the fact that he is a Green Beret and had recently, 3 or 4 months prior to this trip, completed the Army Special Forces qualification course, and by then was an active duty SF engineer sergeant. Definitely not someone you'd want to fuck around with. Given that we both grew up with a passion for the outdoors, he thought it would be nice to take me on a backpacking trip in northern Alabama, the Sipsey Wilderness for those familiar with the area, before he left for 9 months. The trip had gone smoothly up until the third night we were camping out. Around 8 p.m, we had our camp set up. We'd eaten dinner and were sitting by the fire, talking about typical boy shit, guns, girls, and so on. To give points of reference, our spot was about 50 yards from a large stream, and about 50 yards downhill adjacent to the large path. Our camp, the stream, and the path formed a triangle of sorts. This was summertime in Alabama, so it wasn't quite dark yet when 2 guys, who looked to be in their late 20s, wandered up and asked if we'd seen any hogs while we were hiking around. Given that this is rural Alabama, we actually had seen some farther into the wilderness area, and told them so. Even though they were relatively polite. My brother called them good old boys. I got a seriously creepy vibe from those dirty clothes, greasy hair, and scraggly facial hair. I think they probably looked like they belonged in the movie Deliverance. They kind of hung out for a few minutes, maybe a little longer than they should have, looking around, asking us questions like how long we'd been there, how long we were staying, and what looked like them kind of sizing us up. They then abruptly said goodbye and walked away. I didn't necessarily feel threatened by them, and I know for sure my brother didn't, but I still felt uneasy about the whole thing. Fast forward 3 or 4 hours. My brother and I had gone to sleep and were nestled in our tent when I woke to the sound of multiple dogs barking. I've always been a heavy sleeper, and they sounded like they're only about 100 yards away. My heart immediately started pounding, and I kicked my brother through my sleeping bag and asked if he was awake and if he'd heard the dogs. He responded, "I'm awake. They've been getting closer for the past hour or so. Just lay still and don't make any sounds." Needless to say, 12-year-old me was about to shit my pants. We would also hear sporadic shouts from several different sources, but neither came any closer. A few minutes later, my brother whispered, "They're just hunting for hogs. They use the dogs to pin them down, and then they shoot them." This gave me some relief, but not much. Somehow, I managed to fall back asleep. The fact they were doing this at night was a huge red flag, my brother later told me, but I think he was just trying to keep me calm. Fast forward probably another 3 hours, around 2 a.m. I'd managed to sleep pretty well after first hearing the hog hunters when I woke up to my brother squeezing my shoulder firmly, saying, "Wake up, put your shoes on quick, and follow me. Be as quiet as you can." My heart immediately went back to racing because I heard the dogs and voices in the distance, farther away than before, but still distinct. Not asking any questions, I did what he said, and as soon as we were out of the tent, he told me to get on his back. This was a breeze for him after rucking with God knows how much weight in the army. We snuck about 50 yards into the woods, towards the junction of the path and the stream, and crawled into some bushes. It was up a hill, so we had a pretty good elevated view of our campsite. I remember, as we were laying there, how loudly I was breathing, and how quiet he was when I heard the very distinct sound of a pistol slide racking. I looked over, and my brother had his pistol and was watching the campsite and surrounding area. I started to whisper to him when he put his hand over my mouth and pointed at the campsite. The group of hunters had been steadily approaching our camp by this time, about 30 or so minutes, and had finally reached it. There were 5 of them, and maybe 3 or 4 dogs. They all looked relatively young, but 2 had either rifles or shotguns, and the dogs were going crazy, obviously having smelled our scent. For those of you who are backpackers or campers, nobody who comes up on a random campsite in the middle of the night with dogs and guns has good intentions, as you'll know. I knew this, and my brother knew this. I was scared shitless. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but my brother later told me they were talking about us, although we hadn't heard any specifics either. They lingered for about 20 minutes, shining flashlights around and talking to themselves when my brother put his mouth to my ear and said, "If they come towards us, I want you to turn and run as quickly as you can. Don't stop. Don't look back. Stay off the trail and look for the flashing lights." I didn't know what he meant, but I'll come to that later. I knew I could make it because he had taught me land nav pretty well. He then handed me a flashlight and told me not to take the red filter off. He told me later that the red filter helps preserve night vision and cuts down ambient light, so it would be harder for someone to see from a distance. At this point I was so scared, I almost started crying. But at the same time, I had a rush of adrenaline, and what I now think was confidence that I thought I could handle myself. We laid there for a while longer. Then, out of nowhere, they started screaming, "Where are you all at?" and firing into the woods at random. My brother dragged me back behind the crest of the hill and threw himself on top of me. Thankfully, our position on top of the hill meant we were protected from any gunfire. They shot maybe 5 or 6 more times and then headed walking back in the direction they had come from. They got maybe 100 yards away when I heard a blaring siren and saw emergency lights flashing through the woods. It turns out my brother had called the Forest Service office on a satellite phone my family has for emergencies while I was asleep, and they had sent out Forest Service officers and game wardens to our area of the wilderness. The Sipsey Wilderness is about 25,000 acres in size, so it took them a while to get there on the dirt roads. When we saw the game warden truck, my brother signaled them with the light and pointed them in the direction the hunters had gone, and the guy sped off shining his spotlight through the woods. As soon as they were all gone, we went back to our camp, packed up our shit, and waited by the path for the game warden to come back. He then gave us a ride in his truck bed back to the main staging area. On the drive back, my brother told me how brave I'd been, and that we would talk about it with our parents the next day if I wanted to. I asked him not to do that, because I thought they might never let me go camping again. Poof. Creepy rednecks in the woods. Let's not meet again. You might get shot next time. Follow-up. We never got any definitive information on what happened to the rednecks we encountered. I have many friends who have gone out to the Sipsey area and had a great time with no creepy stuff going on at all. However, it truly is a wilderness area, and law enforcement response would be slow. I was lucky my brother was there and reacted so quickly. Otherwise, who knows what could have happened. We also got lucky that, whatever their intentions were, they either reconsidered or lost interest. I will note that when they left our camp, the game warden showed up pretty soon afterwards, but I didn't see what the guys and their dogs did. If I remember correctly, they headed in a direction parallel to the stream, away from the trail, inaccessible to any kind of vehicle. Maybe the warden continued on.
Neighbors lurking in the dark. Restraining order update by Helen on Reddit. I want to let you know, the reason why I'm narrating this is because this person seems to have an actual issue, and if the comment section could offer advice for this person, I'm willing to forward any good ideas over to her Reddit. So that being said, let's begin. Okay, it's been a while since I last updated on the incident I wrote about in the previous update back in March. I've installed security cameras around my home. April 5th, 2016. I got approved for a temporary restraining order against both neighbors. The country does not make it easy. I had to be on the courthouse early to fill out the paperwork. I had to do separate paperwork for both of them. I couldn't just write both their names on the same form, and it all has to be complete and filed by 0900 or you won't be seen. And as for filing, it's not free. I had to pay for both. Eventually, everyone has been petitioning for a restraining order that day. All went into the same courtroom, and all were called before the judge at one time. Some people got their restraining orders approved, others didn't. It was heartbreaking seeing an elderly blind woman denied. It's hard for anyone who can't see to provide evidence. Not that evidence wasn't being presented at the time, mind you. Thankfully, the judge approved of me for the restraining order against both of these weird, fucked up neighbors. I was really worried that I'd get the restraining order against the man approved, however, not the restraining order against the female, just to have the female come to my house and retaliate. Luckily, they were both approved. I then had to pay again to have the restraining order served, which all cost me around $300. Now, this is just a temporary restraining order. It's only good for 2 weeks, and then 2 weeks from when it's filled out. The case for a permanent restraining order is held, to which the defendants, my neighbors, must attend or they'll automatically lose. On April 6, 2016, just as I was leaving for work, I saw a woman being served. She looked irate, but I wasn't getting into that. I thanked the serving officer as he left. I received a proof of service the next day. April 11th, 2016, when I got home from work a bit after 2300, their garage door was open and the woman was sitting on her chair in the driveway, apparently waiting for me. When I parked and got out of my truck, she went into the garage. They weren't leaving me alone though. They were doing so they could, well, cut out of sight and not be on video. The male from inside of his garage started with his usual harassment, insults, and obscene suggestions as I've recorded before. And just to make it perfectly clear, he said my address. I recorded it on my phone, but the quality was poor, even though I can hear them clear as day hooting and hollering. My phone doesn't pick up and play it back so well, so the police who I called over didn't have enough to go on. And didn't have enough to bring them in on the restraining order violation. April 19th, 2016. This is the day I arrived at court early in the morning. I just barely made it in time due to weather traffic. Quite a few people were late. My neighbors were late. I had been terribly hoping they wouldn't show. So what happens when you're going for a restraining order? And this is what happens. Everyone filing for a restraining order that day, and every defendant is in the same courtroom. Cases get called one at a time. First, the judge goes over who's who and who clarifies a few things and blah, 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 and then decides whether or not she will even allow the case for the restraining order to happen. Some people get rejected at this stage, which is fucking bullshit. Then she asks the defendant if they'd like to contest the case. If the defendant contests it, there will be a hearing. This is where both parties present their facts and evidence. If the defendant does not contest it, there is no hearing and a restraining order is simply granted. In my case, both of my neighbors declined to contest it and a restraining order was granted. But don't let that make you think that these people were being rational and sane. Oh no. When asked if they had any questions, they asked the judge if they could counter my restraining order, that is, and then have a restraining order against me. I managed to not laugh. I was already never on their property and never contacting them. They were just doing it out of spite. However, one troublesome thing did happen, and this still bothers me to this day. They tried to claim that I was, and I quote, a danger because I had a gun and I was around his wife. Odd, since for that to be true, his wife would have had been trespassing on my property at the same time he was. If you've seen my previous update, you'd already know what this is about. The male was at my house at 1000 at my door, hooting, hollering, and being extremely hostile and telling me to kill myself and die. And I was armed. I expected him to break in. He didn't know that though. I didn't show my weapon or mention it or allude to it in any way. The only way he knows about it is because of the fact I possess it and have it written on me. This weapon, by the way, is perfectly legal for me to own, and I went through every legal procedure to have it. The judge pretty much blew him off and said if he wants a restraining order, he can go through the application process just like I did. If he does, he'll be wasting his money. Oh, and on that point, while talking to the judge, the woman referred to me as it. They are so lovely. We speculated for a bit, and then there was some things about possibly them being on drugs and alcohol being involved. But just looking at how they behaved in court while presumably sober makes me to believe that these people were really like this, whether they were on substances or not. I was 10,000% ready to go. I had my copies of my police reports, and I had videos on my laptop, and I brought in speakers so to play it nice and loud. There was no way they could have really defended their actions, so if they declined to contest the charges, I would get my restraining order against both of them. Basically, they are not to contact me or be on my property. They must maintain a certain distance from me, except when at their home, because they live there and the judge wasn't going to make them move. Given on how they behave in court, still irrational and unrepentant, I believed it's only a matter of time before they violate the permanent restraining order. Who wants to start a pool? Anyways, that's it for now. After I left that courtroom, I went to a nearby bench to organize my backpack and get on my phone. While I was doing that, the neighbors left the courtroom and they were muttering something in an unkind tone, but I didn't catch it. I waited for them to go down the elevators before I tried to use them myself, as I wanted distance. As I was going down, I met up with a nice lawyer. He decided to drop off a paper downstairs real quick, but agreed to walk me to my car in a nearby parking garage afterwards. He was a very nice man. It's good to know that there are some decent people out there still. Afterwards, I went to a copy shop, got my restraining orders made, and went to the mall. I wasn't there to do any sort of shopping or anything like that, but it was nice to walk around, and honestly, it was a way to deal with excess stress. If these people didn't know where I worked before, they do now, as it's on the paperwork they got. So I dropped off a copy of the restraining orders to my boss on the way home. He was also able to get photos of them off of their Facebooks, so my boss put together a bolo, be on the lookout, flyers for the security guards to watch out for these people. I need an app. I think this is the end, but I doubt it really is. I think it's a matter of time before they start testing the limits of this restraining order and looking for loopholes, eventually allowing it to escalate. I got my guard up. If it ever gets to the point where I have to defend myself, at least I've done everything legal and peaceful to prevent it from ever getting that far. The rest is up for them now. Thanks for listening. As I said, if you want to offer advice in the comments section, I highly suggest you do so. Or if you want to let these people know that I've got their back, you could always go on the Reddit page, make an account, and comment with your advice, letting them know that good old Uncle Creepy sent you there. Hello ladies and gentlemen, it's the end of the video, and I would like to throw a few more promotions out there. I recently came across a channel called Mr. Blue Spooky. Apparently he's a longtime fan of mine, and he makes similar content to me, so if you'd like to check out his content, you can click the link on the screen now, or check in the description. It's whatever you choose to do. He also does Let's Not Meet Stories, and I really think that he deserves a little bit more attention. We also have DrCreepenVanPasta and my buddy Sir Ayme. Again, they're linked in the description and on screen now. However, if you would like to listen to my own dulcet tones, you can always just click on the Let's Not Meet Marathon, which will be on screen now through cards or through clicking annotations. Honestly, it's whatever you choose to do, and if you like to enjoy my content and like to support the channel, you can always send a like, comment, or subscription. Everything makes me feel a little bit more special on the inside, and I always do read the comments, even if I don't always comment on every single one of them. With that being said, I'm your host, That Creepy Reading, signing off.